Gene Osborne, and I'm at the house of Texas knife-making legend Johnny Stout today. We're going to be shooting a hollow grinding video. Hey Gene. Morning Johnny, how are you? Good. We are wanting to shoot a hollow grinding video and thought you might give us some of your expertise.
Come on in.
Y'all come right in.
Okay, this morning we're going to grind 4 blades. We're going to hollow grind each one of them. I've got 2 hunting knives. These are stainless steel. They are not hardened. I've got 2 folder blades. These are about 2.5-inch Damascus folder blades. They have been heat treated, and I grind these blades hard. The reason I do that is if I get any warpage in my blade during heat treating, then I put them on my surface grinder and I can grind them flat again. That way my my blades are going to center up in the center of my frame when you close the blade. So these will be ground hard. The 2 stainless blades will be ground in the anneal condition. I'll grind these on the 8-inch wheel because my blade is a little bit larger, and I do a high grind on all of my blades. So to get the height that I need, I'll grind these on a 10-inch wheel. The folder blades I will grind on an 8-inch wheel. I don't need the larger wheel to get to the top of my spine with my grind. So we're going to be using 2 different wheels, but basically the same technique on both. Okay, to get ready to grind these blades, the first thing we're going to do is mark our cutting edge. And on the 2 blades that have not been heat treated, to eliminate any risk of the blades warping during heat treat, I'm going to grind these blades down to about a 30 thousandths cutting edge. And the way I do that, I've got 3 different tools up here. And you can mark this cutting edge several different ways. This is a little tool called a scratch gauge. This is a tool made by Starrett, and it just has a little carbide blade right here in the end. Has a little table there that you can adjust up and down. You draw that over your blade, turn it around, do the other side. You can also use a set of dial calipers. Set this for the distance that you want. This is just an old pair of calipers that have kind of lived out their usefulness for accurate measurement. So I use that for scribing my cutting edge. And then another really good tool is a height gauge. And this is what I use primarily, but I wanted to show you how I use all 3 of these. So I'm going to do one knife using each one of these different tools. I'll start out with one of the hunters. The way I do that, I take some blue layout fluid and just coat the edge there so that when I scribe my line, it'll show up real well. Now, don't spray your fingers unless you just want to. I'll get a little hand protection on this one since this is such a short blade. You can do all of this outdoors. The stuff does have an odor. Some people it bothers. But anyway, you're going to spray your cutting edges like that. And if you were going to do a double grind on the blade, then you would spray the back also, and then you'd mark the spine of the blade too. Now Okay, you can see I've got all my blades coated here with the blue dicom. And it doesn't matter if you really get it on the side or not. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is mark the two edges on the folders. Now remember, I mentioned that these blades are hardened, and one of the things you have to be cautious of when you're grinding a hardened blade is that you don't want to get it too hot, or you'll draw the temper out of the blade. So keep that in mind. You make a pass, dip it in the water, keep it cool. But since I'm going to take this down to a very fine cutting edge with my grind, so that I don't have to do a lot of hand work or radical sharpening on the blade, I'm going to draw a single center line down the edge of this blade, and then I'm going to grind to that center line. As I said earlier, I'm going to leave this cutting edge about 30 thousandths thick, because we're going to heat treat these after we rough grind them down to about a 220 grit belt. And the way I find my center line on this, I take my, I've got another set of digital calipers here, and I measure the thickness of my blade. So my cutting edge is 89.5 thousandths, and I just keep a little calculator in my shop. So I'll take that figure, .0895 divided by 2 is 4475. And then I'll take my height gauge here, I'll zero it out. This is a granite plate here, so it's very accurate. I'll zero this out, and then I'll bring it up to 4475. So there's 4475. This has a carbide surface on this cutting edge right here, hardened surface. So I'll lay my blade down, and I'll just drag it across there like so. And then I get one bold center line down my blade. Okay, we're gonna mark the cutting edge on the 200s now. We measured this knife at 122 thousandths. So our center line is going to be would be 61 thousandths, and we would take 15 thousandths off of that 61, which would give us 46 thousandths from the edge. So I'll set my height gauge on 46 thousandths, and then I just basically lay it down and drag it across there just like we did on the other one. And then you can see I've got a real wide, bold cutting edge there, which will give me plenty of meat when I go to heat treat. 440, this is 440C stainless steel. And I go to some pretty high temperatures, 1950. So if you get your edge too thin, there's a risk that your blade will warp on you. So leave plenty of meat when you're grinding these things before heat treat. Now we're going to do the same thing with the other hunting knife. We've already set up our, we know that we're going to do, this is the same thickness, 122 thousandths. So I'm going to set my my calipers on 46, just to show you how this is used a different way. Everybody doesn't have the same tools in their shop. You just lay it on there like so. This is not a good tool to use when your blade has been hardened, because these jaws are not carbide, and you don't get as good of a scribe line as you do with the height gauge. But it'll give you a good scratch mark, and hopefully you can see that. My cutting edge is about 30 thousandths thick. Now the other tool I'm going to show you is the scratch gauge. Now this one is a little bit rusted on the shank here, so I have to kind of eyeball this one because I don't have the numbers here to go by. So what I do on this one is I put it up, and I look to where my my center line is going to be, and I make a little light mark just to give me a remember, this is the folder that I'm going to grind thin because it's already hardened, so I want this just to be a single center line down the middle. And I've got it approximate right there. And then you just drag this thing down your blade. I get it really, really good. Since this is a carbide blade in this scratch gauge, then I get a real good center line marked right on my blade there. Okay, we've got our edges marked on our blades, and we're getting ready to grind these. Now what I do, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to grind these two hunting knives on a 10-inch wheel. I'm using a Bader B3 variable speed grinder with a worn 60 grit belt. The reason I'm going to do that, using that belt initially, is that I'm going to knock this sharp corner off here so that when I put a fresh belt on there, I don't strip the grit off of my new belt. The cost of belts, you'll find that you try to get as much mileage out of your worn belts as you can. Now, one thing I want to stress right now, the way I grind is not the only way to grind. It's just what works for me. I started out grinding freehand. Now I grind off of a work rest, and I grind sitting down. And the reason that I grind sitting down is because I'm on my feet for so many hours of the day that it really tires you out. And so I take every advantage that I can to get off of my feet, and that's one of the times that I can do that is when I'm at the grinder. I sit on a relatively high shop stool, and that gets me off of my feet some. Now also, I grind and do a lot of my work, nearly all of my work, using a 5-power or a number 5 optivisor, which gives me a little better view of what I'm doing and lets me see things that I may miss with my eyes or my regular glasses. Now, a couple of things that I want to stress when you're grinding: if you don't wear glasses, I would recommend excuse me, that you wear a set of approved safety glasses. For obvious reasons, you've got hot sparks flying out, and there's nothing harder to get out of your eye than a little hot chip of grinding dust or metal if it gets embedded in your eye. My glasses are safety glasses, and then I wear my optivisors over the top of those, so I have kind of double protection. Now, another thing that I use for 2 reasons. I have a leather, it's actually just a welder's apron that I wear, and I do that for a couple of different reasons. The main one is for safety, to protect myself if this grinder happened to grab a blade and pull it out and sling it back toward me, I would have a little extra protection. But also, when I'm grinding setting down, all of those sparks are hitting me in the chest and going into my lap. And it's very risky if you're sitting there grinding at high speed and all of a sudden you get a hot spark in your crotch and you're jumping up trying to cool yourself off and you've got a hot blade in your hand, and terrible things can happen. So try to keep the sparks off of you and keep yourself protected as much as you can. Okay, the first thing I do after I scribe my cutting edge on my blades and I get ready to grind is that I mark. You have to know where you want your grind line or your plunge cuts to be on your blade. And to help me get those lined up, I'll put a little, take my scribe and I'll put a little scribe mark right across here on my blade, on my cutting edge, so when I'm looking down I can grind up to that mark and stop. And then you have the added need to know the angle of your plunge cut going up your blade like this. And the way I keep track of that is I take a little piece of masking tape, just regular off-the-shelf masking tape, and I'll put it on here and I'll mark the way I want my plunge cut to be. And there's nothing complicated about that. I just line it up with this little scratch mark that I put, and I want my plunge cut to slant either uh, 90 degrees to the spine of my blade or slanted slightly forward. I don't think it's attractive to have your plunge cuts facing backwards, so you have to keep all that in mind as you're working your grind up your blade. And I put a little piece of tape on both sides, make sure I line them up. Anyway, I've got my tape on there, then I get my little X-Acto knife and then I just trim these off so they're not hanging out here in midair, causing distractions. And I just use those as a guide. When I'm looking down on my blade, I can see the little cross mark that I made here, which shows me where I want to stop. And then as I look to my plunge cuts from side to side, I know they're both going the same angle based on my tape. Now after I do that, I'll do that to both knives. Then I'm going to my grinder and I'm ready to start my initial grind. Okay, I'm ready to start my grind. The first thing I'm going to do, I mentioned earlier, I put a worn 60 grit belt on here. And I'm going to take and just knock this corner, sharp corner off of this knife so that I don't strip my grit off when I go to my new belt. The first thing I'm going to do is just turn the grinder on. I'm going to go at about a 45-degree angle. Now, even though you can't see it, when I made those two passes on there, I actually have a very, very narrow and shallow hollow grind already started. Now the way I grind is that, as I mentioned earlier, I grind off of a work rest. My work rest is set up just below the center of my wheel. And after I make that initial pass, I have already established my hollow grind. So each pass that I make, I try to stay in that hollow grind, in that hollow that I've established there. And when I look straight down on my blade from the top, I try to leave just a hairline crack. Now by that I mean that I can see a slight gap between the face of my wheel and the cutting edge of my blade. Now I'm going to make 4 or 5 passes on here so I can expand that initial hollow grind to show you a little bit more. I've got my grinder running about 50% speed here. This is a variable speed, and I'm running about half speed, so I don't want to remove a lot of metal real fast. As you gain experience, you can increase your speed and increase your grit sizes. And we're going to stick with this belt right here for right now. Then we'll go to our coarser grit, or our new belt, in just a moment. You can see my hollow grind is starting to develop now. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm grinding off of a work rest. I use a push stick to apply pressure to my blade. That way I can control the aggressiveness of the cut. By applying more pressure, it'll cut faster and deeper. But it helps me control, and then I'm using this hand to guide the knife and either apply the pressure into the blade or away from the blade. I also can rock the blade like this on my work rest, and let the belt do the work, and just basically what I'm doing is guiding the knife. This is not the only way to grind. It's not the correct way to grind. It's just the way I grind. You'll find that you'll find what works for you as you get more experience and more practice. Try this. If it doesn't work, then search out another way to grind and see what works for you. Now I'm going to extend my hollow grind a little bit more on the other side. Then we're going to go to the new belt, and then you'll see this thing develop right up the blade. Okay, there's the other side. I've got about 1/4 of an inch of a hollow started there. And you can see I'm not quite back to my tape yet, where my final plunge cut's going to be. But remember, I'm going to be working through several different grits here. And as I go farther up the blade, I'll gradually work this plunge cut back toward the tape. Primarily now, I'm just wanting to get my angle straight so that I've got the same angle of grind on both sides on my plunge cut. And by the plunge cut, we're talking about where your belt is actually cutting in to your blade, grinding your bevels. And the area behind your plunge cut in the front of your bolster, excuse me, is called the ricasso area. So when I get through here, I'll have about probably about a 1/2 inch thick ricasso. And if I want to mark my blade, then that's a good flat place to mark it right there, either with a stamp or a stencil. And I use a stencil, so I can either mark it here or mark it out on my blade over here. But it gives me an option. Okay, I'm going to go to my new 60 grit ceramic belt. Talk a little bit about belts for a second. This blue belt you're seeing here is a silicon carbide belt, which is pretty aggressive. But for my rough grinding, I have gone to ceramic oxide belts, and they are usually orange or yellow in color, and the life of those belts is probably 10 to 1 of a aluminum oxide or silicon carbide belt. Okay, one thing I want to mention right now, and it comes into play later on, but you need to know about it. When you're getting into your finished grinds on your blades, I'm using a coarse grit here. This is a 60 grit. Actually, it's an 80. No, it's a 60 grit ceramic belt. The benefit of the ceramic, it cuts very, very deep because the grit is so sharp and it doesn't dull like aluminum oxide or silicon carbide. So a 60 grit scratch on a ceramic belt is about like a 36 grit scratch on one of the other belts. So if you're doing small blades, be careful about using really, really aggressive grits because they're hard to get out. So even on my smaller blades, I'll normally use an 80 grit, and this is to me is not a. It's about an average size blade for the knives that I make. But the larger your knife, the deeper the coarser you can grits. Obviously, you can use because you've got a lot more material there to take off. But the point I want to make is that when you get into your finer and finer grits, the thickness of this belt gets a lot thinner. And what happens, the radius of your wheel actually changes. One way to overcome that is to use a soft belt, and then there's a new belt out made by, I think it's Norton. They're called Norax belts. They have a very thick backing on them. And that thick backing allows you to maintain a more constant radius on the cutting surface of your wheel because they're closer in thickness to your coarse grits are. And also when you apply pressure to a soft wheel, that wheel has a tendency to expand and fill up your hollow grind and give you a good smooth cut there. Now most grinders that you're going to order are going to come with a 70 durometer belt, and durometer is the way that the hardness of rubber is measured. So a 70 is relatively hard. On a serrated wheel where I'm going to do a lot of metal removing and aggressive grinding, I'll use a harder serrated wheel, possibly a 70. But when I get into my finer grits, I like a smooth wheel, and I like a smaller durometer. I like a 55, and that gives me some compression for that belt to expand when I'm doing those grinds on those thinner belts. Okay, we're back to our 80 grit ceramic now. We're going to go through the same steps. Start grinding on one side and go the other. I'm starting at the plunge cut. Trying to stay in my hollow grind, leaving the hairline crack between the cutting edge and the face of my wheel. You see me rolling the blade over there. that was about 10 or 12 passes on that blade, and you can see that I've got a good deep hollow grind established. I'm going to grind a little bit farther up on this blade, but remember, this is not heat treated. I still have to drill the holes in the blade for my guard and my handle, so I'm probably going to match the other side to this one, and then I'm going to stop. After I heat treat, then I'll come back and I'll regrind this blade with a, this is a 60, I'll go back to an 80 and I'll start regrinding, and then I'll do my finished grind, 80, 220, 320, 400, 600, then I'll satin finish the, rub satin finish the blade by hand. But that gives you a rough idea and the length of time that it takes to grind a small blade like this right here. Of course, as you gain experience, your speed and your grinding will improve. But anyway, we're going to grind the other side now. Doing the very same things we did on that side.
Keep my line.
Okay, we finished the two hunting knives. Now I'm going to grind the two little folder blades. Remember that these were pre-hardened, and I only have one center line for my cutting edge. So I've got to be a little bit more careful. I don't want to get that cutting edge too thin, and I definitely don't want to get it hot. Now the way I hold these, since the tang and these have all been pre-fitted to my folder, I put a little piece of leather on there, and I grip them with these little small 4-inch vice grip pliers. Gives me a neat little handle, lots of control. Now, because my blade is so thin and short, I'm going to finer grit belt. This is a 100 grit, and it's a new belt. I may be able to grind the whole blade with this belt. It just depends on if it gets too dull, then I'll switch. But I may be able to grind the whole belt with this one. So we're going to do the very same thing. We're going to knock both, put a 45 on both cutting edges, on both blades. We'll do that first on both of them. Break the belt in a little bit. Be extra careful when you're grinding carbon steel because the sparks will ignite, and if they fall in your lap or in your shoe, they'll literally set you free. So be real careful. You see right there. Turn my blade over now and do the other side. Starting at my plunge cut, working right out toward the point. Be careful of those sparks. Since I only have a center line, right now I'm staying away from that. I don't want to erase that line. So I've got to have it as a guide all the way up through my finer grits. Then I'll start thinning my edge down some. I'm going to do my other one now. I track my belt over just a fraction over the edge of my wheel. And as I get finer and finer into my grits, that belt will kind of roll over, and it'll roll up in this plunge cut here, and it'll keep from getting those scratches so deep up in there and so hard to get out. Starting at my plunge cut, just rolling it over the face of the wheel as I get out toward the point. Keeping that hairline cracked when I'm looking straight down on it. Keeping that hairline cracked between my cutting edge and the face of my wheel. And that grind will crawl right up the blade if you do that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and finish this one out since I've already got it in the vice grips. Go very slow, mild pressure. Let the belt and the grinder do the work. I just guide the blade. Okay, I've got a good bevel started on both sides. I'm going to switch back to my coarse belt now and work a little more aggressively. But I think I'll slow my grinder down a little bit to a slower speed. I have a lot more accuracy at slower speeds. This is an 80 grit ceramic. The hunters we did with the 60 grit. I readjust my work rest each time because the thickness of the belt is different with each grit, so you have to move that work rest in or out. You don't want to leave a gap big enough for it to suck your blade down in, so keep it as tight as you can get it on there. You see I've slowed my belt down about half speed of what it was before. I'm about 25% now. I'm going back to my right side, starting at my plunge cut. See, I'm still stripping grit off. It'll do that for the first couple of passes. Okay, this is as far as I want to go with my coarse belt. This is an 80 grit. What I'm going to do now is refine this. I'm going to grind the other side with the 80 up to this point right here. Then I'm going to refine it and start thinning my edge down with my finer grits, 220, 320, 400, etc. So I want to leave a little meat right up in this spine area here. If I get it too high, then I'll grind out through the top, which is acceptable on some styles of knives, but I like a little shoulder, a little radius right in this corner right here on my folders. So I go real slow from this point on. A lot of times I'll take it, if I'm not doing a really good job of grinding, I'll take it up to about a 220, and then I'll hand finish everything from that point on by hand. Doing the same thing here, leaving that little hairline crack. Okay, I've got quite a bit of meat removed from both sides. I've got my hollow established real well. I've got a good taper going on my blade, and on this particular blade, on this grind, what I'll do is I'll stop right now, and I'll pick up my other blade, and I'll grind it down to this point, and then I'll come back and I'll start refining those with the 220 grit belt. For now, we'll just pick up where we left off on this one. Yeah, where I really start refining that is when I go to my 220. Why that belt's walking on the right there? Okay, I've got the first side ground. I'm going to rough grind the back side, and then I'll start refining my grind on a 220 grit belt. Work for my plunge cut out to the part, keeping a fine hairline track. Make sure I keep it cool, because it is hardened. Got this side rough ground, and I'm getting kind of close to the top here. I still have a little bit of left before I get to the spine, but I'm gonna hold off now till I get to my finer grit, and then I'm just gonna blend this in, refine my taper on my blade, and start doing that with the 220 and a 320 grit belt. Okay, I've got my 220 grit belt on here now. This is a ceramic. It's a very aggressive belt, made by 3M, and so I'm going to turn my speed down a little bit and then start refining this grind, start thinning my edge down, blending my taper in there. First thing I'm going to do is start evening up my plunge cut. The way I do that is tilt my blade at an angle like this, and then just real gently just go into that plunge cut. Clean it up. Then feather my belt over the edge just about a 1/16 of an inch. Go in here now, I'm leaning on the edge, so I'm trying to refine and thin down the edge, and I also want to work up, take this on up to the top, but I want to do it real gradually. I get there too fast, then my edge will still be too thick. Now you can see it's slowly climbing up my blade, but I don't have my hollow. I don't know if you can see it, but I don't have my hollow established out here toward the point, so I'm going to have to start blending this hollow and keep my depth out here. Actually, I've got kind of a flat spot right here, right in this area here. So I'm going to work out toward the point. That's as far as I want to go with my my 220. I've still got a little ripple right here, but I'll take that out with my next grit. You can see I've still got a little bit of area in this corner right here to take out, so I'm okay right now, but I won't go any farther with my 220. Go to the other side of my belt now. Do the same thing. Get up in my plunge cut, clean that up. Now, one thing I want to do at this point, even though I had a center line scribed down there on the cutting edge, I'll start gazing down the back of my blade and down the cutting edge to make sure that I'm keeping my cutting edge right in the center. It's real easy to get off a little bit, so before I remove all of the metal that I have, then I'm gonna just eyeball it and see where I need to grind particular spots, keep that cutting edge in the center. And I usually bounce back and forth from one side to the other as I start refining that. Bending my edge down, trying to stay off of the spine. Got a little bit more I have to do on the first side, so I'm going to bounce back over here. Get in my plunge cut a little bit more right there. Refine that a little bit. Good way to even it up too. Just kind of tilt the blade out so that I'm not hitting up in here, and let the belt do the work right in the plunge cut itself. A little bit more refining in this plunge cut. slow my belt down just a little bit more. Got one little spot here I need to work out. Now, this blade is about 99% finished. I've got it completely ground to a 220 grit, and you can probably see a lot of my pattern in my Damascus showing up in there. This is a wave pattern. What I'll do next, I'll take a 320 grit and I'll hit it about 2 passes on a 320, and then I'll hand finish this belt using just sanding blocks and 400 and 600 grit paper, wet and dry, before I etch the blade. But other than just a couple of passes on 320, I'm through with my grinding. I've got a good taper in the blade, got my cutting edge in the center, I got my blade down refined very close to where I want it, the final thickness. A couple of passes with the 320 and I'll have the exact thickness that I need on the cutting edge. So we're going to go back to the other blade now, work it over with the 220. And then we'll be through with those two. This is the first one we did. It's ground down to an 80 grit. Refining my plunge cuts a little bit. And then my edge down just a little as I go. Make sure I keep the blade cool. Remember, these are hardened blades, and if I turn it blue, I've drawn the temper out of it in that particular spot. Okay, we've got this side about as far as I want to take it with the 220. I still have a little bit of shoulder right up here in the corner, which is what I want. I'll blend all of that in. Got a little tiny ripple right through here, but I'll blend that with my 320 when I get over there. So I'm going to move the other side now. Start out by refining the plunge cut, and then blending the starting to work on my cutting edge and my taper. Slow it down just a hair. Checking to see if my cutting edge is in the center. See if my taper's coming in straight. Got a little bit to work on right up in here. On my taper. Maybe a little more right on the point. Okay, I've got my plunge cuts relatively even, got my edge thinned down, got my edge in the center all the way down, have a good steady taper from the point, and so that's all I'll do with the 220 grit belt. Everything else now will be 320, 400 and on down. Okay, on the two folder blades, I stripped off my tape that I had to match my plunge cuts up, and cleaned up my tang area right here. And what I'm going to do now is sand off my tangs a little bit. I just put a sheet of 600 grit wet and dry down on my marble slab here. And I'll sand these tangs, get any scratches or anything out of them that might have gotten in there when we were grinding. Do both sides, get those nice and clean. Then we're going back to a little finer belt from the 220 that we finished up with. We're going to hit a 320 first, and then we're going to go to a 22 number 22 Norax belt, which is about a 400 grit, and then we will hand sand from there on, and then I'll show you what one of these blades look like after after it's completely finished and put in the knife and the knife finished. Anyway, we're just going to go back to the grinder now with the 320 grit. Okay, these are the two blades, rough ground with a 220 grit belt, ceramic belt. The tangs are rough finished with a 600 grit. After I completely hand finish the blades, then I'll go back and finish the tangs again before I etch them. They'll all be hand finished. The next step is to hit them with the 320 a couple of passes, and then go to a number 22 Norax belt, which is equivalent of about a 400 grit. Okay, this is a 22 grit Norax belt. They're made by Norton, and it's the equivalent of a 400 grit American grit. The grit is put on like a file. One thing I like about them, they have a real thick back, which helps compensate for the radius of your wheel as you go down from the thicker through the thinner belts. So if you use a soft wheel that has some give to it, and use these finer grit belts that have a thick backing, it'll fill up your hollow, and you'll get a really smooth, clean grind with either none or very few little ripples or bobbles in there, which is one of the common problems with hollow grinds as you go to your finer belts. It's harder to hold that belt in the hollow because the radius of the wheel is smaller. Okay, we just finished making a couple of passes on these blades with the 320 grit belt. Now we're going back to the Norax X22, which is about a 400 grit. We're going to hit a couple of passes with this, and then we'll be through, except for the hand finish. I'm turning my grinder down real slow. You can almost count the revolutions as it goes around, because I want to have a lot of control. You know, I'm doing more polishing now than I am removing metal. I'm trying to remove those 320 grit scratches that are in there, and I'm just basically trying to grind off the tops of those scratches, bring them all down. Bring them all down even on the blade. With this belt, if you look real close, you can see how it lays over and wraps around, rolls right up into my plunge cut there. You get these belts from True Grit. They're a Norton distributor. They're very expensive, but they're worth every penny what you have to pay for them. Okay, that's a 400 grit finish, and I can go directly to a 600 grit by hand and have a mirror polish on that in just a few short minutes before I etch. Won't be actually mirror polish, but if I were going to buff this, I could go directly to a buffer and put a mirror polish on this blade. But since it's Damascus, I'll do a little light hand sanding and then etch the blade to bring out the pattern. Turned over and do the other side now. Again, this one's been done with the 320. Get right up in our plunge cut there, get that nice and clean. Okay, that's it. That's a 400 grit finish. Got a good taper on my blade. Nice uniform shoulders. Just a slight little radius right here in the corner, which is what I like. Okay, we've got the other blade now. We've ground it with the 320 grit. We're going to the X22 Norax. We'll hit it a few passes on here. It'll be ready to go. Again, I'm doing more polishing than I am removing metal. Got that side. Okay, this is the first knife that we ground. It's ready to have the holes drilled in it for the bolsters and the handle, and heat treat. After heat treat, we'll regrind the blade, clean up the flats on it, hand finish the blade, and get it ready to put the bolsters and handles on. Now here's the other knife that we've heat treated. We've sat and finished the blade, got the bolsters put on, and it's ready to put the scales on now. Okay, these blades are the same blade that's in this knife right here. Actually, this steel right here is the same pattern as this, off the same billet. This is a raindrop pattern blade here. But to give you an idea of what these two knives will look like, they'll be very similar to this one. Same model. This is my citation folder, and this is niter blued, is how I'm getting the color on that blade right there. The bolsters on this knife here are fire blued, but after I etch these, I've got several options. I can just etch them and leave them black, or I can hot blue them, which will be a dark gun, what we call a gun blue, or I can niter blue them, and I can get a variety of colors out of that Damascus by niter bluing it. This one just happened to, due to the steel, I got a real pretty blue out of it, but you can get some purples and greens and reds, and it's all based on the heat of your salts when you're niter bluing those. Okay, one of the things I'm going to show you now, give you a few examples on comparing a hollow ground blade to a flat ground blade, and some of the things you're going to run into with these different grinds. I'll show you an end section of a flat ground blade. I'll try to draw it big enough so you can see it. Okay, a flat ground blade, if you're looking at it from the end view, it's going to look something like that. It's exactly what the name implies. The sides are completely flat ground, and then you've got a sharpened cutting edge on it. A hollow ground blade, if it's ground correctly, is going to look something like this. And a lot of this will depend on your grind, of course. But what happens when you sharpen these two different type blades, the flat ground blade just keeps getting thicker and thicker. The more it's used, the more it's resharpened. So your blade, your cutting edge becomes wider and wider, and can get to the point that it's almost like an axe as far as the more of a wedge shape. If this knife is used enough and it's sharpened enough. Now what happens with the hollow ground blade, the more you use it, actually the finer your cutting edge is going to get. Till you reach a certain point, and then beyond that there's nothing you can do. But just keep in mind that for cutting, slicing, a hollow ground blade will give you a lot thinner, keener edge, and normally will let you be a lot easier cutting with that blade. Now there are some exceptions. There's another blade, and it's actually called a convex blade. It is almost a flat ground blade, and this is very radical, but it's almost like this right here. And this is a very functional blade and performs very well under a lot of conditions. But because the grind comes actually to the cutting edge, you don't have this wedge shape as early with sharpening that you do with a pure flat ground blade. Because when you resharpen this same knife, you don't have this bevel on the edge. You actually sharpen the cutting edge itself. And if you wear that off, you put another edge on it and you take it down to the cutting edge. So this is very functional, and a lot of your larger knives, bowie knives, camp knives, field grade knives, will have this kind of an edge, and it's very durable and is a really, really high performer for chopping, hacking, doing really rough chores. The hollow ground blade, if you think about this blade in little pie wedges, okay, we've taken these two pie wedges away, so now all we have is the center. So what we've done, especially with the high grind, like we did on this knife and the other knives that I just ground, you've reduced a lot of the weight, and possibly up to 2/3 of the weight, if you taper this blade like you see here. Not only you're removing these two pie wedges, you're tapering the blade to the point, so you probably in actuality remove 2/3 of the weight of that blade. Well, when you do that, there are some definite benefits, but there are also some trade-offs, and you have to keep this in mind. When you take that weight out of there, then this is not going to be a good chopper. This is not going to be as good a chopper as either the flat ground or the convex ground knife because of the reduced weight. But it'll have a very keen edge. It's a good skinning knife. It's a good hunting knife. It's a good all-around utility camp knife. But in most cases, unless it's a huge knife with very, very shallow hollows, it's not a good chopper. Keep those things in mind. There's one other thing about a hollow grind you need to know. Now this has to do with when you're grinding the blade. I don't have the formula in front of me, but there are formulas that will tell you, depending on the size of the wheel. This is an end view of your bar stock. And there are formulas that can tell you how high of a grind, this would be the spine, how high up on your blade you can grind with a certain size wheel, depending on the thickness of your bar stock. I'm going to give you some rough estimates because, like I said, I don't have the formula in front of me. But for an 8-inch wheel, you can grind approximately 3/4 of an inch. Now, if you try to grind higher than that, I'll show you what happens. And this is very extreme. If you start trying to grind higher with the smaller wheel, you'll start getting an hourglass effect on your blade. And then you have this situation right here. Now that's not a lot different than what I showed you a while ago, but what happens is you grind, as you sharpen and continue to work your cutting edge up, you get up here into a certain point in the middle of this hourglass, and your blade becomes a lot thinner than it is on the cutting edge, and you have a very weak spot right here that your blade can either bend or it can ripple under the right conditions. So to grind higher, a 10-inch wheel, you can grind somewhere around, I'm going to say 1 inch for a 10-inch wheel. And these are not right on the money, because you can, with experience, you can actually grind this whole 2-inch blade here with an 8-inch wheel. I've done it before, but you have to be very experienced grinder to do that. So with a 10-inch wheel, you can grind approximately 1 inch up the blade. With a 12-inch wheel, you can grind approximately 1 1/2 inches. And with a 14-inch wheel, you can grind about 2 inches. Don't take that to the bank, because somebody will prove me wrong. But these are approximates here. That's the reason when we ground this blade, we ground it with a 10-inch wheel, because this is approximately 1 inch tall, okay? The smaller folder blades were about 3/4 of an inch, and that's why I elected to use the 8-inch wheel on those. Now, had my hunting knife been about 1.5 inches, although I don't have a 12-inch wheel, I would have needed to step up to a 12-inch or step all the way up to my 14-inch wheel, which I could do. Now, just the reverse applies when you're talking about big wheels. You can grind a blade that's 3/4 of an inch high. You can grind that with a 14-inch wheel, and what you get is a very shallow hollow grind. It's almost to the point of being flat, but it's very, 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 very shallow hollow grind. An 8-inch wheel, you'd have a grind excuse me, you'd have a grind more like this. Going to be a lot thinner in the middle, because you're going to be grinding deeper and not as high. These are just a couple of basic concepts of a hollow grind versus a flat grind. And like I say, if you're just starting out, keep in mind that you can do small work with a big wheel. You can't do a lot of large work with a small wheel. So if you're thinking about setting your grinder up for the first time, you might consider going with the larger wheel initially. There is a higher cost. They're probably another $50 to $100 more expensive as you step up in size. But if you're in it for the long haul, it'll be worth it to you.